Discover the untold story of college hookup culture with American Hookup by Lisa Wade. This insightful and engaging audiobook explores the complexities of modern relationships on campus.
One of my students' female friends said that she wanted to just get it over with, but not to just anyone. She wanted to make sure that she lost it to someone hot. So she picked out a guy she liked the look of and worked on getting introduced to him. They exchanged numbers at a party and texted for about a day. Then, after a week or so of hearing nothing from him, he sent her a text very late on a Saturday night, and she decided to just do it. She never heard from him again, but she was happy that she'd lost her virginity to someone she had a crush on. In the New York Times, Kate Taylor profiled a first-year student at Penn State who decided to lose her virginity to a guy in a hookup. "I could be here for 4 years and not date anyone," she observed, so she didn't imagine she'd have the chance to make it special anytime soon. She picked someone who was super hot and nice. They had sex. It was a one-time thing, and she felt great about it. "I came back with the biggest smile on my face," she said. "All of my friends are jealous because I had such a great first experience." If virginity doesn't make sense to some students, voluntary abstinence among non-virgins is even less intelligible. With the all-important initiation no longer standing between them and sexual activity, there are few culturally understandable reasons not to go for it. My pansexual student, Ren, expressed this kind of uncertainty, and I was rather surprised. With a straight back and sleek, chin-length hair that came naturally to sharp points at her earlobes, she seemed extraordinarily self-assured, far more than any first-year student had the right to be. She had come out nonchalantly to her dad in high school, waiting until the commercial break in the baseball game he was watching to tell him that she'd been on a date with a woman. "Oh?" he said, indicating no concern. "How'd it go?" Ren felt no consternation about her sexual identity, but she was anxious about her level of sexual activity. Before arriving for her first year, she assumed that college kids were having the best sex of their lives, were crazy and wild, and had sex all the time. She wasn't entirely certain that this was an accurate portrayal of college life, and yet she still felt compelled to compare herself to it. "I know that I should want to have sex all the time and should take advantage of it when I get the chance," she wrote anxiously in her journal. After declining a hookup with a friend of a friend, she chastised herself. "I started to feel like it was something that I should have done, and because I didn't, I felt like a loser or uncool. As confident in myself as I am, or so I thought, thoughts kept running through my head like, 'You're at college and you're not having sex. What's wrong with you?' She wondered if she was a prude. "I'm so embarrassed by that," she wrote, contemplating the possibility that she wasn't into hooking up. "I feel as if by not voluntarily taking part in it, I am weird and abnormal." Ren did take part a little. She was among the 36 students I called dabblers, students who hooked up but did so ambivalently. Some were curious, convinced, or swept into the scene. Some were crossing their fingers for a relationship, and some just mustered up a sort of when in Rome attitude. There were lots of reasons to go for it. Setting out to measure students' motivations, sociologist Jeremy Wecker and his colleagues surveyed over 500 students at Duke University who'd hooked up at least once, asking them to indicate whether they did it for excitement, for pleasure, to fit in, to find a partner, or because they were too busy for anything more. They found that half of their students were what they called utilitarians, students who were hooking up in the hope that a committed, monogamous relationship would evolve. They made a bargain with hookup culture, an acceptance of its terms in exchange for the possibility of emerging with a boyfriend or girlfriend. "I wanted to find love," confessed a student at George Washington University. "Hopefully it's something more than a hookup," said a utilitarian at Stanford. "Many of my students expressed something similar. I've been going about it how I usually do," wrote a bisexual woman, "which is to hook up with them and hope the feelings come out of it." Burke was a utilitarian. He wasn't attracted to the idea of hookups, having always been a relationship-oriented guy, and he didn't want his interactions with women to be distorted by drunkenness, but being asked on dates made his peers feel uncomfortable. "It's harder to ask someone out," than it is to ask someone to go back to your room after 15 minutes of chatting, he observed wryly. Meanwhile, living in a residence hall made it extremely easy to hook up. He was keenly aware of the absence of parental figures and the close quarters he shared with women. Plus, he was nice-looking, tallish, with blonde hair and a baby face. So, women looking for someone who seemed safe found him appealing. With one of these women, he had what he called a mutually exclusive attraction, or fling, that lasted a couple weeks, but he never wanted it to be just a hookup. My intentions were for things to lead towards a solid relationship involving more than partying together, he wrote. With traditional dates off the table, Burke inevitably found himself in the occasional hookup, in the hope that it would turn into something more. If half of the students polled by Wecker and his colleagues were hooking up in the hope of a relationship, another quarter were doing it for less strategic reasons. Reflecting the fact that these students didn't articulate any single or clear reason why they liked hooking up, Wecker's team called them uninspireds and unreflectives. I prefer experimentalists. I feel as if by not voluntarily taking part in it, I am weird and abnormal. Wren did take part a little. She was among the 36 students I called dabblers, students who hooked up but did so ambivalently. Some were curious, convinced, or swept into the scene. Some were crossing their fingers for a relationship, and some just mustered up a sort of when in Rome attitude. There were lots of reasons to go for it. Setting out to measure students' motivations, sociologist Jeremy Wecker and his colleagues surveyed over 500 students at Duke University who'd hooked up at least once, asking them to indicate whether they did it for excitement, for pleasure, to fit in, to find a partner, or because they were too busy for anything more. They found that half of their students were what they called utilitarians, students who were hooking up in the hope that a committed, monogamous relationship would evolve. They made a bargain with hookup culture, an acceptance of its terms in exchange for the possibility of emerging with a boyfriend or girlfriend. I wanted to find love, confessed a student at George Washington University. Hopefully it's something more than a hookup, said a utilitarian at Stanford. Many of my students expressed something similar. I've been going about it how I usually do, wrote a bisexual woman, which is to hook up with them and hope the feelings come out of it. Burke was a utilitarian. He wasn't attracted to the idea of hookups, having always been a relationship-oriented guy, and he didn't want his interactions with women to be distorted by drunkenness, but being asked on dates made his peers feel uncomfortable. It's harder to ask someone out than it is to ask someone to go back to your room after 15 minutes of chatting, he observed wryly. Meanwhile, living in a residence hall made it extremely easy to hook up. He was keenly aware of the absence of parental figures and the close quarters he shared with women. Plus, he was nice-looking, tallish, with blonde hair and a baby face. So, women looking for someone who seemed safe found him appealing. With one of these women, he had what he called a mutually exclusive attraction, or fling, that lasted a couple weeks, but he never wanted it to be just a hookup. My intentions were for things to lead towards a solid relationship involving more than partying together, he wrote. With traditional dates off the table, Burke inevitably found himself in the occasional hookup, in the hope that it would turn into something more. If half of the students polled by Wecker and his colleagues were hooking up in the hope of a relationship, another quarter were doing it for less strategic reasons. Reflecting the fact that these students didn't articulate any single or clear reason why they liked hooking up, Wecker's team called them uninspireds and unreflectives. I prefer experimentalists.
They were drunk enough to just plop down on the concrete, and he tried out a line he'd been practicing for months. "Look, girl," he said, "give me a kiss right now." They bonked their foreheads together in their eagerness, and they laughed. Omar thought it was perfect. "My first kiss made me feel like I was on cloud 9, he wrote later, ecstatic. I could not wait until the next weekend, when we would get drunk again. And they did. This time, there was no forehead bonking. They got horizontal. Even though I had this religious background and a strong desire to save my virginity for marriage, Omar wrote breathlessly, I was willing to throw it all away that night. Omar wasn't 100% on board with what happened in hookup culture, but he was willing to dabble. I hope to meet more women, he wrote, and explore them sexually, enjoy the art of foreplay, without the actual play just yet. At the end of his first year, he announced half-jokingly that he had gone from not being open to anything to basically open to a full-blown orgy. Students like Omar and Riley found hookup culture hospitable enough, but there are also students who, like the man interviewed for Gay Sex in the 70s, are truly enthusiastic about the free love that hookup culture promises. These are students motivated almost entirely by fun, excitement, and pleasure. Wecker and his colleagues called them uninhibiteds. The final fourth of their sample fit the description. A similar proportion of my students, 23 out of 101, did as well. I call them enthusiasts. Enthusiasts said things like, I jumped at the opportunity, and it was everything that I wanted. Owen was an enthusiast at the beginning of his first year, though not at the end. Mara's friend Naomi, the girl with the scraped knees who bragged about sleeping with the guy in sunglasses, was an enthusiast too, and she would remain so years later. Miranda, our intrepid guide at the burlesque party, certainly was. I consider myself an active, often enthusiastic participant in hookup culture, she had declared with satisfaction, spontaneously using the word. Enthusiasts came in all types. Hiro was an enthusiast. He was a square-jawed white and Japanese American with an intense gaze. While queer men in my sample tended to feel at least a little uncomfortable in hookup culture, Hiro was an exception. Being bisexual, he actively partook of the whole range of hookup options. Anything that moved, he wrote with zeal. His journals sometimes just took the form of a delighted list of people he danced with, kissed, or slept with that week. He preferred his hookups to be clean and emotionless, and much of the time, that's what he got. Overall, he wrote mid-year, embracing the college hookup culture has been incredibly exciting and fun. Esther had been an enthusiast since she lost her virginity at the age of 14. Her parents embraced her precocious sexuality, making sure she had the tools to keep herself safe and giving her permission to be as sexually active as she wished. She'd never been told to feel guilty about her sexual activity, and she didn't. In college, she proceeded quickly to intercourse and hookups, and slept with a handful of some of the most desirable men on campus. She had amazing sex, she said, and also enjoyed being thought of as an amazing fuck. Definitely an enthusiast. Petra was one of the few students who started their first year as an abstainer and left it as an enthusiast. When we last saw her, she was wavering, sitting in her dorm room feeling like a weirdo, wondering if abstaining was the right thing to do. Spring break would put an end to her uncertainty. She spent most of it at home in South Dakota with her family. But on Friday, she went to Brookings to spend the weekend with her friend Sasapa, who was enrolled at State. That night, she and Sessa went down to a boys' room and they poured Petra her first ever alcoholic drink. It was vodka and lemonade. She had one cup, and it made her feel giggly. She remembers flirting with the boys, getting tickled, and being in bed by 1:30 a.m. The next night, she and Sessa found themselves at a house party that was significantly less low-key. This time, they drank vodka and orange juice, and Petra was feeling a bit more brave. In the basement, she noticed a boy playing beer pong, who she thought was really cute. His name was Wyatt, and when his game ended, she scooched over on the couch to make room for him. He took the invitation, squeezed in, and they started talking. When Sesa got up and made more room on the couch, she wrote, I made sure to not scooch away. One thing led to another, and at the end of the night, Petra claimed her first hookup. The next morning, she flew back down south. I could not stop smiling, she recalled. Wyatt was so cute. I had a really fun night and don't regret a thing. Back in her own dorm room, Petra had a different outlook altogether. During my entire first semester and first half of second semester, I stayed away from parties and college dances because I had no desire to go, put myself out there, and meet new guys. She wrote in her journal, however, when I was in South Dakota, something changed. It was Wyatt, she said, and probably the vodka. He gave her butterflies. The next Saturday, she talked her roommate into going to their first college party. Like clockwork, two guys pulled our butts against them, she reported, and just like that, Petra had opted in. She hooked up that night with a guy from her calculus class. Wyatt was really cute, but this guy was super hot. He was the second of 5 hookups in the last 2 months of her first year, including one with the hottest guy in her dorm. "I don't know that the party scene fit like a glove," she said later, "but better than I thought it would." Students with the most casual sexual experience are the most likely to report that it brings them unadulterated pleasure. Enthusiasts such as Hero, Esther, and Petra are probably having as good a time as they claim. A study at Cornell found that for enthusiasts, casual sex was associated with high self-esteem and low rates of anxiety and depression. This was certainly true for Hero. Having so many people interested in him made him feel fantastic. "My ego was inflated to astronomical levels," he remarked with glee. While most enthusiasts had no trouble finding at least a few people to hook up with, some, like Luke, struck out completely. Luke, to his own horror, was a virgin. In large part, this was because he'd grown up in a conservative town in the American South. His mother was a homemaker, and his dad spent most of his career in elected office. Being the son of a politician made coming out more difficult than usual, and there didn't seem much point in doing so anyway, since there weren't any other out gay students at his high school. So, even though he had known he was gay since he was 15, he waited until he started college to say so. He was probably also inhibited because he didn't yet know how likable he was. He was endearing, his face more kind than handsome. He was a bit awkward, tall, lanky, and noticeably nervous. But instead of being off-putting, his features and quirks made him seem humble and sincere, which he was. Luke had always been a bit doleful, but as a freshman, he was more so than ever. He tormented himself with crushes that were obsessive and poorly managed. All of his loves were unrequited. "I felt repulsive," he said, and he figured that this state of affairs would continue in perpetuity. Coming out as gay to his peers didn't bother him at all, but he hated coming out as a virgin. The most traumatic of these admissions happened late on a Friday night when his friend Adriana burst into his dorm room, grabbed his arm, and pulled him 3 doors down the hall. 9 students were stuffed into her room, sitting on the bed, on chairs, and on the floor. All people Luke was familiar with from the queer student group. They cheered and raised their red cups as Adriana pushed him through the door. They were playing Hot Seat, a confession-based drinking game that usually devolved into a contest over who can uncover the most embarrassing things from their peers about their sex lives. Students were thrust into the circle and peppered with questions. It was Luke's turn. He knew, he recalled, that it would be highly unpleasant. The last thing he wanted was to make his non-existent sex life the center of attention. He tried to retreat, but the crowd was persuasive and, despite his protests, the interrogation began. The first question was, "What is something that you do every time without fail during sex?" Luke stammered and floundered. He wasn't sure whether to lie or tell the truth. His brain raced to think of a thing, something, anything people do during sex. His friends started to notice his discomfort and started throwing out suggestions. Like, "Close your eyes," Adriana offered. "How about wear a condom?" said the safer sex advocate of the bunch. When he spit out that he'd never actually had sex, everyone was suddenly silent. "It was a very uncomfortable experience," he wrote. "Once again, I was the only virgin. They tried to make him feel better." "Well, it's nice to wait," one of the other gay men in the room said, his voice wavering at the end of the sentence. But Luke wasn't waiting. He was involuntarily virginal, and that just made him feel worse. "I sat in this room with a bunch of other queer people," he wrote, "and I can see on their faces that they are wondering what's wrong with me." He bolted. He went back to his room and cried. Luke was in the small category of students I call strivers, ones who opt in but feel shut out. His agony would come to an end, as we'll see later, but for the time being, he was part of a group for whom hookup culture can be especially cruel. It's hard enough to feel excluded, but to fear that it's because others find you sexually unappealing is a twist of the knife. As someone who hasn't opted out of hookup culture, Luke wrote, but rather someone who is excluded by virtue of his awkwardness and definitive lack of allure, I definitely feel a bit victimized. He apologized for the dramatic language, but I don't think calling his experience victimization is too far off the mark. Social psychologists call it a microaggression, A remark that, intentionally or not, reminds the listener that they're an outsider. It hurts. Like Luke, strivers may be shy, self-conscious, or socially awkward. Xavier was one of those. He described being obsessed with sex in high school, but always unable to seal the deal. College didn't turn out much different. I was scared to go out and party and things like that, he confessed, because he remembered all the rejections he got in high school. He spent the year on the margins of hookup culture. I think the hardest thing for me to do at this point, he wrote at the end of the year, is to accept the fact that I'm an 18-year-old, rising sophomore virgin. Students who are physically disabled or neurologically different also often face exclusion. A combination of others' discomfort with disability, stereotypes of people with disabilities as asexual, and a social hierarchy that rewards perfect bodies and socially adept interactions puts most disabled students at a disadvantage in one way or another. The Occidental College alum Carrie Wade, who only coincidentally shares my last name, wrote about her experiences with sex as a lesbian-identified woman with cerebral palsy. Specifically, that there was none of it. One of the difficult things to do when you have a disability, she wrote, is get somebody to fuck you.